Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. The biggest and most valuable property that you can buy with the best mortgage loan terms is the residential fourplex building. Sometimes, though, they're hard to find. Today's fourplex developer noticed exactly that problem, and he's been successfully creating Build-To-Rent Fourplex communities for years. Learn about the specific opportunities in fourplex buildings and the pitfalls to avoid today on Get Rich Education. Most rental property investors choose either cash flow or home price appreciation, but one real estate market can give you both. Jacksonville, Florida, with 27% lower home prices than the national median, 1% higher gross rents, and Jacksonville has appreciated 34% more than other comparable cash flow markets over the last 30 years. Get positive cash flow today and appreciation for tomorrow. To invest for cash flow and growth in Jacksonville, go to cashflowandgrowth.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Reading, Pennsylvania to Reading, California, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. This is Get Rich Education. Thanks for being here. You're back in that abundantly minded place where you won't live a day below your means when you realize that instead you can spend your time expanding your means. A great way to do that, doing more with less, is with a fourplex building, 4 dwelling units in one property. And before we get into that, I've had a few listeners write in lately. You can do that, by the way, at getricheducation.com/contact. They wrote in asking me if I still think it's important for you to invest predominantly for cash flow, since I've been talking more about appreciation lately. Let me be clear. Yes, I buy for positive cash flow, and I recommend that most others do the same. And it is exactly what I've done as a direct real estate investor for 18 and a half years now, and I have never wavered on. Unless you know specifically what you're doing, or maybe you're a high net worth individual, because I have had some people tell me that they just simply don't need the cash flow. I've only been talking more about property appreciation lately because we have had higher rates of appreciation, and understand too that you might not even want appreciation to take place in real estate if you're just getting started, because you're going to have to pay more. In fact, I think that 1 year from now, rents will not have increased by much, but prices will have increased substantially, such that the properties you buy 1 year or 2 years from now could be less profitable than they are today. Now, I know, I understand, I felt this too. It might be tempting for you, especially if you're a new investor, to buy a property with negative cash flow, and then you rationalize that you're going to be just fine because you expect so much appreciation that you just don't care. Well, all right, that might work out for you, but understand that that is the end of investing and the beginning of speculation. Let me be clear again. No, I do not advocate for buying at negative cash flow, because what if property values went down plus you still got the negative cash flow then? How would that make you feel? There are also a finite number of situations like that that you could absorb, so I don't recommend it. You still buy for cash flow on the day that you buy, even if it's a thin cash flow. I've had other people ask me recently about the 1% rule, that desirable 1% rent-to-price ratio. Well, that is not a rule, and it never was one. That is a guide and maybe a rule of thumb, but it's never been a hard and fast rule. With the lowest interest rates in Freddie Mac history, which we can now say is 50 years since they've been tracking rates since 1971, it allows you to go lower on the rent-to-price ratio and still have positive cash flow. If you're an experienced real estate investor, you probably understand that rent amounts are more firmly anchored than housing prices are. Rent amounts don't change much, and home prices do. So whenever home prices eventually stagnate, that's when rents have a chance to catch up again. But we are squarely not there now. In fact, we're nearly in the opposite place. Now, at some point, mortgage interest rates are likely going to rise as well, though few think that that's going to happen anytime soon. Some say it'll be at least 2023 until that really happens significantly, but no one really knows. Now, when interest rates go up, understand that people don't want to sell their homes anymore. Think about it. If you've already got a 3% interest rate on your home, but now rates are 5%, well, this impedes home sales because if a homeowner moves, they're going to lose their low rate and then you would be punished by paying the higher rate. So what this does is these higher rates lower the available inventory that can come onto the market. That's exactly why higher interest rates equal lower inventory. Well, we're already at low housing inventory, even in this declining rate environment. So the dynamics are in place for the housing market such that this chronic supply-demand imbalance really sets up well for you if you invest across so many different housing types. A lot of residential investors, though, they do want more fourplexes. Now, some property providers out there might offer you a duplex or even a fourplex here or there. But today we're talking with a developer that was in the real estate investment world for a long time. And he also noticed that investors demanded more fourplexes. So he decided to actually do something about it. He started his own company years ago to specifically meet that need. And he does it with brand new construction fourplexes in U.S. states that have high population growth. Because as you probably know by now, the fourplex is that biggest building, 4 doors under one roof, that you can use a conventional loan on. Those mortgages with the best rates and terms. He put a report together for you that tells you about metro markets and shows floor plans and more in these high growth markets at getricheducation.com/fourplex. Let's learn more. I'd like to welcome Steve Olson onto the show. He's an expert at developing and constructing fourplex buildings specifically for investors. Steve, welcome back onto the show.
Awesome to be here as usual. My third time on the show. Thanks for having me back.
Indeed. It's been more than a year and so much has happened in that more than a year. But when we talk about real estate investing, and we think about that from macro to micro, since you do build these fourplex buildings and you build them specifically for investors, I often talk about how the market is more important than the property. So bigger picture, just tell us about why you've chosen some of the states and the metro areas that you have and where they are.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things that you're going to look at when you're considering the metros that you want to be in. You know, sometimes we get lucky. I think the start of this company over here was lucky. We happen to be in a really good market, the Salt Lake City metro.
Yeah.
That fits a lot of the criteria that we're looking for. And yet, if we think about a lot of rental properties that people are buying remotely, I think the markets that we service are pretty different than a lot of them. That's not good or bad. It just is what it is. We're predominantly serving the Intermountain West. We've done a little bit in Texas as well, but you're talking Utah, Idaho, and Arizona. That's where we operate. And so some of the common themes over those markets is, number one, they do tend to be landlord friendly. I like to laugh. I'll talk to an investor from San Francisco or somewhere like that, and they'll say, well, tell us about your rent control. And we laugh. We're like, we don't know what that is. We've got private property. If somebody doesn't pay rent, you can evict them.
That's like a foreign language. Yeah.
It's crazy. I mean, believe it or not, that can be done. So we're operating in those states. That's one big reason. And we like the diverse economies, right? You've got all kinds of different jobs that people can have in various sectors of the economy. So anywhere from tech, medical, government, education, manufacturing, logistics, right? A lot of those kinds of jobs. And you can really even zero in on that more on the micro level to some of the submarkets too. But if we spread those markets out on the whole, that's the kind of jobs that we're going to be looking at. And then we need demand, right? We need there to be legitimate demand for housing, which is the case almost anywhere in America right now, but it's pretty acute in the Intermountain West. We definitely have a shortage of supply. And so when you're talking about turning over hundreds of doors within a submarket, it makes you sleep a lot better at night when you know there's a shortage of supply on the market because you know that the tenants will be there to absorb that inventory that you're going to bring. So those are a couple of the things that we look at when we're considering markets on a high level.
Looking at Utah, Idaho, and Arizona. So I know it's just outside Salt Lake City and other environs. It's just outside Boise, and it's just outside Phoenix. And we look at those three states on the state level, Utah, Idaho, and Arizona. They have high population growth rates besides just having diverse economies. The United States grows at a population growth rate of about 0.6% per year. These states are multiples higher than that, even more than 2% population growth in some of these states within a housing shortage. So you can begin to understand the demand for the product that way. Well, Steve, when you look to delineate a tract of land, first of all, for building these fourplexes, whether that be on the edge of a metro or whatever it is, where do you decide where to buy just within that particular metro? For example, I imagine that you need to keep the cost of land low so that you can pass a deal on to investors since they're concerned about things like their income and their cap rate from the property. So tell us more about selecting that land.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I haven't finished the list yet. I doubt I ever will. Every time we do one, you learn a little bit more about, hey, if we would have looked at this a little bit more, maybe we could have planned something different. But really, some of the aspects that we're looking at, the most important one is, like you said, that price of the land. A regular home builder is going to look at some land they can buy, their cost per square foot. What do I have to sell this house for to make money? For us, it's completely in reverse. When we look at this build to rent model, we look at that land and say, what can we rent a property for, right, on this land? And more importantly, too, then you have to back into, well, what's approved or what are we likely to get approved? Is it a townhouse? Is it apartment style? What's our bedroom count, our bathroom count? And then we can drill down into rents from there. That's a lot of the things that we're looking at. And then you've got to look at the surrounding neighborhoods. What's happening? I was down in Phoenix last week and I looked at probably 7 different job sites and I liked 5 of them, but 2 of them, they were right on every count, but they were surrounded by scrap yards, Jiffy Lubes, and it was just hard to imagine somebody wanting to live in a project like that.
Right.
But when we look nearby, I know it sounds silly, but we love it when there's a Walmart and a Chick-fil-A across the street, right? We love it. We can put up a gated community. We know tenants have got all their amenities right there. We love it when there's schools nearby, even traffic patterns, right? We've said no to a couple of projects because they were a right in, right out, meaning it was really going to be really tough for cars to turn in and to arrive at the project the way that you wanted to. So even with some of those traffic patterns, you might pass on a project versus say yes on one. And then too, what we're looking at, there's one that is coming in on the south side of Phoenix that we're going to do that's near where the 202 freeway is just going in. And so that just opens up a whole bunch of development. It makes a part of town accessible that previously wasn't as accessible. So we know what's coming. Right. And when you're in those city planning meetings, you're hearing about new developers getting different projects approved. You're hearing about new roads and new amenities, and you want to get out ahead of that stuff. And it really has a benefit because this is a long runway, Keith. I mean, we're talking about years down the line before we're signing any rental applications. So you really got to be aware of that stuff because what you're looking at now is not going to be what you see in 2 years.
This is having that long-term vision. And yes, this is going to a community council meeting or whatever it is, getting that insider information that would be illegal if this were in the stock world, but it's completely legal to do in real estate, getting that vision as to where the infrastructure and amenities are going to be, and therefore what might be a good deal for a site for building fourplexes like this. And when we come to having chosen the site, tell us more about that construction and the layout of the properties themselves, these fourplexes, whether that be townhouse style or apartment style, and some of the other amenities around the site.
Yeah, we continue to learn more and more about that one through the years, right? There's this balance that we continually have to strike between livability and density, right? When you're a developer, you want to pack it in there, right? That's profit. Get as many units as we can. But guess what? If you do too much density, nobody wants to live there. Or even if they do, your turnover and your vacancy is so high that it really hammers on your performance of your assets. So we've got to look at that density factor and create a livable community, something that you walk through and go, hey, this is nice. It's well kept. I got room to take my dog on a walk, right? I've got a driveway going up into my units or whatever it is. And that, Keith, is of course very relative to the submarket. We're also looking around at what are the other amenities? What are the other type of floor plans that seem to do well, especially too, if we can look at, hey, what are they really short on? Are they really short on 2-bedroom units in this submarket? Are they really short on 1-bedroom units? What does the market need? What need is not being fulfilled? So we're going to look at that. And then just the community layout as well, right? Where you place that clubhouse, where you place a dog park. Sometimes you can take some of those common areas and use those as a buffer zone against a neighboring property that maybe is not as desirable, right? Where people don't want to come in at their front door and look at it. So you try to move around and adapt to the surrounding areas accordingly. That really does help. But, there's a reason, for example, that a lot of apartment complexes, when you drive into them, you drive in the gate and right there's the clubhouse with, a bunch of guest parking, and behind that's a pool, and you kind of drive around in a rectangle to access the units that are behind the clubhouse. That works really well, but not every site lends itself to that. Right? That's not always possible. So you have to try to imagine, what's it going to be like for tenants as they roll up to this place? What's going to make them happy to be here? What's going to make them want to stay when it's time to renew their lease? And, you don't have to over amenitize. A-class units, they've got the dog groomer, the package delivery, everything under the sun. And, we've found that kind of tenant, as nice of a property as that is, not everybody can afford that Ritz-Carlton type experience. In fact, there's more and more of a demand forever for that B-class unit that's got a little bit of amenity, right? So maybe we got a pool, basic playground, and a dog park, and my rents are affordable. So I still get that managed living experience. We're seeing that more and more because, as you know, the middle class is getting compressed, and what people can afford is getting to be less and less. So we're trying to really fill that middle market niche, and that's what speaks to community layouts and amenities.
Oh, you said so many interesting things there. My personal mission in real estate investing is to provide housing that's clean, safe, affordable, and functional. You bring up affordability, and you don't want to over amenitize, or then you dent affordability. And also you bring up competition. Maybe, for example, if for the $1,500 a month rent space, there aren't any other places nearby that have garages, you can offer an affordable rent and offer garages. If the competition isn't offering something like that, you're giving them value, but yet you're not over amenitizing at the same time. So it's such a local phenomenon to study.
It really is. Yeah. So much of it is just relative to what's happening in the nearby properties. So you have to take all that into consideration. And we've been on both sides of that one before, right? Where we know we're well below where the competition has to be, and vice versa. You got to kind of compete with them. But if you pick the right markets with the right population and employment trends, those things do kind of take care of themselves over time. We call it the absorption rate. Inventory absorbs. You have a big steak, well, you're going to digest it eventually. And sometimes it's harder. So we'll absorb that inventory, and there's little tricks of the trade you can do to make it go faster. And other times things happen that are beyond your control that makes it go a little bit slower. But once again, good employment rate, good population growth, you are going to be fine in the long run. This will take care of itself.
Now, a little later, we'll tell listeners where to get a report that you put together for them that has a lot of photographs and layout plans and so on with the fourplexes, but just help us see in our mind's eye what the neighborhood really looks like in these fourplex neighborhoods, because we're not talking about infill projects. We're talking about an entire tract of build-to-rent properties.
You're talking about an entire project. This isn't as if you're driving through a neighborhood and you see one or two properties. Right. You're going to see 50 or 60 properties. And by 50 or 60, I mean that times 4. So you're hundreds of doors. So it really kind of depends on whose perspective you're looking at this from. This is probably a good unintentional segue, Keith, into financing that I'll get to in just a second. But if you're a tenant, you're driving through that and you're saying, hey, here's a bunch of townhouses, or here's an apartment complex. That's how you view it as a tenant. Well, how you view it as a lender is, hey, this is chopped up into tax IDs that are each 4 units. These are actually fourplexes. So that becomes very, very important because you still get some of that managed community aspect that you would with an apartment complex, but you really get to maximize that fourplex asset, which I think is awesome because it's the best kind of money to use. It's conventional financing, whereas, you can only get a certain amount of those type of loans. And if you're getting these at a fixed rate of interest, but you're maximizing the unit count per loan, so 4 loans, you're making the best use of that money, which you probably paying attention. You saw the government passed a new stimulus bill. So there's more money headed into the market, more inflation probably. So maximizing the income you get off of that fixed rate debt, I think is really key.
We talk about that an awful lot here. A fourplex is what allows one to optimize their loans. A savvy real estate investor often wants to get as many of those QM loans, those qualified mortgage loans, at the best rates and terms where a single person can get 10 and a married couple can get 20. Though this would be a rare scenario, therefore a married couple could get 20 fourplexes and have 80 doors, all at these QM loans, which even for an income property has been between 3 and 4% interest rates lately. And if you want to optimize your leverage and optimize the inflation profiting benefit that you get when you tie up long-term fixed interest rate debt, again, this would be an unlikely scenario. But if these new construction fourplexes, and we'll talk about the prices later, but just say they're $800K, so you get a $600K loan on those. Well, therefore, you have $16 million worth of property, $12 million worth of debt at 75% loan to value ratio if you indeed got 20 properties as a married couple. So therefore, with $12 million in debt, which again is outsourced to your tenant, you would have $240K of annual inflation profiting at just a 2% inflation rate. And you've tied up these loans for 30 years. And I brought up the point recently, Steve, that when interest rates are about the long-term rate of inflation, over that 30-year period, even if the property produced zero cash flow and zero appreciation somehow for 30 years, that investor still wouldn't lose money. So that's really the opportunity with fourplexes and the rates that we have today.
Oh, that's so true. It's almost like you thought about that before, Keith. Yeah, it's so multidimensional. You got to keep score with a couple of different categories when you're talking about owning real estate. Cash flow is just one of those categories. We talk about the appreciation and the depreciation as well. I just refinanced one of my personal fourplexes. You know, I eat my own cooking over here, and I got it down to a 3.5% interest rate.
Beautiful.
30-year fixed rate loan, right? So what I love about that loan, it's not a knock on commercial investing. Commercial investing is great, has so many advantages, but you do have to pay that loan off every 7 to 10 years or refinance it. On this true 30-year fixed rate loan, I don't have to do that. As long as I can make the mortgage payment, nobody's doing a lease audit, right? Nobody's doing a capital call, or I don't have to pay it off. I can just hunker down, right? And I can wade through any storms that come my way. And it comes with some great depreciation, especially if you're a real estate professional. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, but some of the cost benefits that come with the new cost segregation on year one bonus depreciation, we'll see if that hangs. I don't know if that's given what's happening politically. It could be iffy, but wow, the tax savings alone make that investment worth it for like a decade for me.
You're doing a lot of this at scale when you tie up 4 doors with one mortgage loan. I don't use a lot of profanity on the show, but when we come back, I might just very well breach that topic. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Steve Olson. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. The people that our listeners can't stop talking about are Ridge Lending Group and MLS 42056. They provided you with more loans than anyone. It's where I got my last few loans, and they finance single-family income property up to fourplexes. They're the #1 lender for both beginners and veterans. Start your pre-qualification, chat with President Chaley Ridge personally, and you'll end up with your custom plan for expanding your cash-flowing portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com. Congress just made it possible to get up to $100,000 out of your current 401k or TSP to invest in real estate, gold, or even your own business. That's even if you're still working, and avoid the IRA UBIT tax. The thing is, you can get your money tax and penalty free for a limited time. The EQRP is your secret weapon. With the CARES Act expiring soon, the EQRP company helps you unleash your retirement funds now. Learn more and text message EQRP in all capital letters to 72,000.
This is Rich Dad Advisor Ken McElroy. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking about one of my favorite topics of all time, a fourplex building, a 4-unit building, a quad, if you will, whatever you like to call it, because it's how I began in real estate investing, with a 4-unit building. And now we're talking with a build-to-rent developer that builds these specifically for investors. And that brings up a naughty word in the industry, at least for real estate investors, Steve. Typically, we don't like that profane term, term HOA, homeowners association, or condo association, we think about how they're going to restrict our ability to do things, especially how that association often has quotas with the percent of units in their association that can be rented out versus owner occupants. But that's not what's done with HOAs in these fourplex communities. Tell us about that.
So are you going to put the little black and white explicit tag on the Get Rich logo now?
Parental advisory.
Yeah, it's getting foul, but let's talk about that because there's two ends of the spectrum that we need to think about here. Number one is we've all been through these fourplex developments in cities across America that were built back in the 70s, and now they look terrible.
They do.
Nobody's been taking care of them. They're run down. You know, people are parking on the lawn, hanging up sheets in the window. There's toys all over. Lawn's not mowed. We want to try to avoid that situation, obviously. If you can't attract good tenants, because that's what your project looks like, that's a problem. But when you start talking about solutions to that, do you automatically go to the other end of the spectrum here, which is that terrible HOA that everybody's afraid of? It's got the busybody board that's always doing special assessments and hiking the dues and wasting your time and jacking up your fees. How do we settle somewhere in the middle? Well, one of the ways that we're going to do that, of course, is the fact that everybody in this project has the same goal that you do, is they want a clean, safe, insured development. You're not getting that typical busybody homeowner because you're all there as investors, right? You've got a pretty straightforward objective that you all want to accomplish together. And, you know, it gives investors some control. I'm actually on one of the boards right now. I'm the president of one of the boards. And that's what's great is you can make adjustments. If you notice, you visit the project, there's a little bit of garbage over here, or maybe there's a little issue with dog waste. These are things that you can deal with. You can say, hey, you know what? We got to ratchet this up to, a couple more inspections a month, or we've got to do these things. You have the power to make the community better. You also have the power to be cost conscious and do what the market needs to be done, because what we can't have is we can't have a community where nobody is minding the store, where nobody is making sure that people are parking where they're supposed to, that the garbages are emptied, and that there's insurance on these buildings. We found that to be really, really key. And if you go look at these projects that we've done over the last 5 to 10 years, you can go through them. You can, somebody takes care of them. I've been to a couple of them before. We're like, hey, this is looking like we need to get more frequent landscaping or more frequent trash pickup. Or you can adjust with that stuff. You're not at the mercy of a manager that is just going to do it their way or the highway. So you have influence in that HOA. So where you can get to that middle ground. You don't have the busybody homeowner, but you don't have the 70s fourplex development either.
And it's so true. That first ever fourplex building I bought, it's only about 5 miles from my home. I can drive there today, actually, just like I could have driven through there 10 or more years ago when I owned it. You just see dumpsters all over the place, and therefore there's often trash blowing around, swirling around. Yeah, problems with pet waste. That's a common thing. And really the test on whether an HOA is working is not driving a development 1 month after it's been built. It's taking a look at it and putting eyes on it with Google Street View or whatever at year 5 or year 8 or whatever that is. Looking at your properties, they really do have a lot of curb appeal. They have nice siding, of course, fresh paint, because we're talking about all new construction projects here, smart landscaping, and so on.
Yeah, that's the idea. You want to give that experience and know that it's all going to be well taken care of. In 5 years, the trees are bigger, but that's about the difference that you see, right? This thing has been well maintained and well kept. So the HOA is there to do exactly that kind of a thing, and there to interface with the property manager too. Those two worlds, even though they are separate, there's an intersection point. And when we can control that in-house and have those two cooperate with one another instead of compete with one another, that's a challenge in build-to-rent when you're dealing with separate companies that are fulfilling various parts of the service. An HOA might be tempted to say, well, yeah, I do this, but the property manager, or the property manager, well, I could lease this unit, but the HOA, that's the last thing you need. You need those two people talking to each other and collaborating, because what counts is clean, safe units that can be rented at that right market rate. That's what everybody is signing up for.
When investors buy fourplexes there, you offer them the option of the property management. And of course, there are pros to not having infill projects, but instead having dedicated tracts to a number of fourplexes. That creates ease of management efficiency there because things are proximous. Of the investors in the fourplexes there, what percent of those investors choose to self-manage? How many choose to use your manager? And how many choose to use a different manager that they find?
It's interesting is we made a change that we have a requirement for a period of time to stick with our management. And it's not to tie anybody's hands because there are ways that over time that can go away. But here's what we're thinking about, Keith. If we're going to put 200 doors onto the market to rent over a 6-month period, having 6, 7, 8 property managers all out there advertising, posting signs everywhere, quoting different rents, using different qualification metrics, it's a problem. That's difficult. So when we have it all going through our internal management for a nice uniform lease up to spread those tenants out, we can minimize that impact for the investor because you really have to view it as, what if you build a 200 door apartment complex and then you had 10 different property managers? That's going to be kind of a nightmare. We got to get to the stabilization point where we're running 95% occupied. And at that point, there are some ways in place where if somebody wanted to self-manage or take over, they could potentially do that. But frankly, most of them don't do it at that point because they go, what am I going to make a change for? I'm 95% occupied. That's a key part of the build for rent space when you're doing it in any kind of quantity is how you want to handle that management piece.
That's right. There's a new build here. There's a strong character of neighborhood to maintain. That's a fresh mindset. That makes a lot of sense. What are the management fees?
Depends on the market, but predominantly here in the Intermountain West, it's going to be 7% of the gross rents collected and a lease-up fee of $150 flat one time.
That's quite reasonable, especially with that lease-up fee. Very approachable.
It is reasonable. Thank you for saying that. I told 2 people that today that disagreed with me, and I said, go call a few other management companies and let me know what you think. It's a good fair fee because the management company gets some economies of scale with that. Normally, you'd be expecting to pay 8 to 10% in these markets for management. But when they've got all the doors in one place, it's something they can pass a little bit of a discount on to the investor.
Yeah, it's a leasing fee that I find especially low. Nationally, I see a leasing fee. And if you're a new investor, a leasing fee just means that one-time fee that a property manager charges you for placing a new tenant, something that might only happen every 1 to 5 years. And that fee is typically 1.5 month's rent. I've seen up as high oftentimes as 1 full month's rent amount charged as the leasing fee in addition to the management fee. So about 7% and $150 is very reasonable.
And we've had to be there, a half a month to a full month in our Texas projects. That's how you have to get deals done. That's very common throughout Texas, the South and the Midwest. But you'll see that happen in various points here in the Intermountain West. But yeah, we've found that with the quantity of doors, a flat fee like that is reasonable. It works well for the investors.
Tell us about how it's really worked for the typical investor that might have purchased a fourplex in one of your build-to-rent fourplex communities 5 years ago, like how it's actually gone for them and how this has improved their financial picture or some pitfalls to avoid.
There's a little bit of nuance to everybody's situation. But one thing to consider is if you bought a fourplex 5 years ago here in the Western United States, you're a very happy camper.
Right. I think you are.
And that is if you still own it, because you could have sold it and made a decent profit just because the market itself has been appreciating really well. I mean, I tell people that we get that forced appreciation component, which comes from converting land to its highest and best use, right? It's just like renovating an old beat down apartment. If you go and put $30,000 into it, it's probably worth $60,000 more. There's that multiplier that you get by adding value. So you get that. Typically, I never promise it, but it's very common because you produced an income generating asset. But we've also benefited from a general rise in the market, shortage of housing, continued increase in building materials. It's just been brutal. That investor that bought 5 years ago, I would say 7 out of 10 of them still own and they're pretty happy. And when I go to them and say, hey, will you sell? We have somebody that wants to do a 1031 exchange. They don't want to. Because they got to do one now. They got to go exchange and find somewhere to put their money. But then there's been another, 3 out of 10 or so that have sold. And a few of those may have invested their capital elsewhere. Many, though, have gone in and just exchanged into more FIG assets. The thing about these is some of the projects that we do, go okay at first. Some go kind of pretty good. Some are grand slams. But if you give it time, if you let that trend of population growth and solid employment take hold, you end up with a brand new, steadily cash flowing asset that you're happy with. And I've seen that come time and time again. I don't mean to get too into the weeds, but I had a client buy 4 fourplexes from us in our Provo, Utah project called Blackstone Farms. And a couple of years ago, he wasn't that happy because he had 2 fourplexes get completed in the dead of winter. That's just kind of the way it went, Keith. And in the dead of winter, you don't have a lot of tenants showing up. And you're trying to lease these units when you can't landscape. It's a muddy disaster. Right? He wasn't that happy. I said, you just got to hang on. I promise this thing will turn around. And sure enough, later that year, okay, he's rented. All right, fine. I'll see how these go for a while. And then eventually comes into some more capital. Hey, you know what? That wasn't too bad. Let's go do that again. I'm making money. I've got a brand new asset that's been relatively hassle free. There's examples all over the board, but they pretty much all end up where that one was. I got cash flow on a brand new asset.
If you're not going to put money at 4-to-1 leverage with these low interest rates into a cash flowing fourplex in growth markets, then where could one better put that money? I mean, that's really a valid question.
I don't have the answer, but if you find it, let me know.
I still haven't found it myself. You deal with mostly fourplexes there. You also have properties other than fourplexes. So tell us about that product type, rents, and prices.
We get some different products that come along occasionally, like we're working on one right now where the city wants us to do a couple of things. They want some commercial mixed use product put in along the highway where this is going to be. And actually, they also want some affordable housing. So we've got to put a deed restriction on a certain percentage of these and sell them on the affordable market to the essential workers of the county where the property is. That'll be our standard product, but the different product will be those mixed use buildings. So if somebody's maxed out on their Fannie Mae loans, but they really like the submarket, we'll have a couple of commercial units on the bottom floor. You know, that's like a chiropractor or dentist office. But then above that, you've got a mixed bag, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom residential units. That product specifically is a 26 unit building. So that's somebody that wants to bring in a fair amount of capital and control and own a bigger asset. And it's just going to be captured in the association with a whole bunch of our fourplexes. We get out of the box occasionally, and some people even like to syndicate this stuff. Keith, they'll come in and say, hey, I want to buy 5 or 6 fourplexes, get a couple buddies together and raise the money. And in that case, if you're going to buy that quantity, you're going to be commercial financing by default. But you should talk to us because we have some good resources there that are used to doing that kind of a loan.
Tell us more about the fourplexes and some of the others. I know at times you have triplexes and so on, and just how things look for an investor in a rent to purchase price ratio scenario.
It, of course, depends on the market. If you look at these in the West compared to the Midwest, for example, I own properties in Indianapolis. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, that 1% rent to value ratio was pretty common. You could kind of get that in your sleep. That's tough now. I think here in the Intermountain West, we're at more like a 0.7, but you do have the benefit of much lower property taxes. So you know as well as I do, Keith, that rent to value ratio doesn't tell the whole story because it makes no attempt to talk about expenses. You can deal with a little bit lower rent to value ratio as long as that is offset in the expenses. So these fourplexes that we do typically deliver at cap rates in the mid to high 6s. There was a day when they were north of 7, but those days have kind of come and gone. So they're mid to high 6s on brand new product. And you typically have got that forced appreciation. I don't like to guarantee it, but when you do get those income producing assets, it's not an uncommon thing to see.
You can look at that rent to value ratio. Of course, with a fourplex building, you begin to look at some of the benefits of economies of scale. You've got 4 doors under one roof, but you're probably not going to pay 4 times as much in an insurance premium as you would for a single family home. It's going to be less than that. The same with your property taxes. Just some examples of the economies of scale. But it is a more substantial investment than it is for your 50-year-old turnkey renovated single family home. Oftentimes, I know your product's $750K or more, and then an investor needs to be looking at making a 25% down payment plus 5% closing costs on that.
Yeah, exactly. We're just trying to play real life Monopoly here, Keith. For some people, they can start with a product like this. Other people need to start with houses, and that's great. I mean, they're an excellent springboard, or you might decide to stay there. These all have their pros and cons, right? The typical investor that does this ends up, they've got a couple $100,000 they need to deploy. especially when you're looking at investors that have more than that, maybe 3, 4, 500,000. When you put that up against the Fannie Mae rule that you can only get 10 properties, you're going to burn through those 10 loans in a hurry with that kind of capital. So you have to think about these economies of scale. How can I put that quantity of money to work in one property that has more doors is a question that I think most people are going to eventually ask themselves. It's kind of a natural progression to end up at that point, to want to maximize those loans. So it's a business owner, an attorney, physician, somebody who's just done really well saving over the years that has that kind of capital, wants to put it to work. That's the typical client we see. And, we've even started to see some bigger companies and even some institutions flirting with this idea a little bit.
Tell us about the buyers that choose to use means other than a cash down payment, whether that be IRA funds or something else.
You've got a cash down payment. If you're going to use IRA funds, it's a little trickier. You know why, Keith? Is when we talk about a construction loan, the banks that are willing to do those loans are small regional banks or credit unions. And when we're doing a loan through qualified money like an IRA, that's got to be a non-recourse loan. That's the law of the land. I've not found a small local bank or credit union that's willing to do a non-recourse construction loan because they view that as inherently a little bit more of a high-risk product. They say, hey, construction, it's a little bit fluid. I don't know how this is end. I don't want to not have any recourse. So that's a challenge. People have done those successfully on all cash. Like, for example, if we have a duplex and want to come in, maybe they got $350 in an IRA, they buy it all cash. And then when that duplex is completed, can you use financing then? Absolutely. You can get NASB or one of those, familiar banks that does those kind of loans to come in and take you out at 50 to 60% LTV on a product like that. And it begins to work that way. Other investors too, if they've got a sizable amount of cash, they act as their own construction lender because they're going to save a whole bunch in interest and loan fees on that construction loan if they come in with the 7 or the 800K and then maybe refi on the back end. So there's a couple of ways to do that. And even some people go in as partners. I've had people come in each, 3 or 4 investors with 50 to 100K each, and they go do a fourplex together. So there's a lot of ways to skin that cat, as they say.
Tell us more about that timeline, because it is typically a longer timeline between when an investor comes in, gets a construction loan, and then later on converts that to a long-term loan.
We're going to tell you about a project that we have coming up. And usually we don't even talk about these things until we're at least 80% confident that they're going to happen. But you're looking at 6 months of runway, usually before we can even start closing construction loans and going vertical. We got to buy the land. We got to go through entitlement and city approvals. And then we got to do the horizontal improvements, right? We got to bring in the roads and the utilities and the water and all those things to get these finished pads that we can build on. And so you're looking at, it kind of depends on where you catch us, right? If you catch us at the very beginning, it could be 6 months. If you catch us at the very end, as we record this, I've got some units available that start construction in February of 2021. So you've shortened that runway considerably if that's something that you're after. But then you've got a construction timeline of 10 to 12 months. The builder's contract says 12. It might take 10. Plan on 12 and be pleasantly surprised if it takes less. And then you've got that lease up period. And so people all the time say, well, why would I be crazy enough to do that? That's less and less of a difficult argument to make now because you know how short inventory is. And why would I be crazy enough to do that? Well, what else is there? There's not a lot out there right now. Of course, you've got that new construction, that equity bump, and potentially the cost segregation benefits from new construction. So there's a lot of reasons to do it. But bottom line, 12-month minimum runway, probably closer to 18, depending on where you catch us.
Well, this can be an exciting proposition for some people. With these new build fourplexes and similar products, you get economies of scale. You have that new build product where you shouldn't have maintenance issues for quite a while. And of course, those great loan terms. So tell us what you have available now.
We're working a lot in the Phoenix metro right now. We've got some properties on the west side. We really like to work the west side, and we're working the south side now too with the completion of that 202 freeway that's coming around the South Mountain. So we've got some projects in Surprise is where we're working a lot. You'll probably see us come out with some projects in Peoria and then Phoenix proper, as well as a Levine Township. Those are areas that we're working pretty heavily now. When we go live here, your investors can expect to contact us and have more rolling out the door, including a little bit of a drum roll, Keith, one that's in a federal opportunity zone. And this FIG business model is uniquely qualified to take advantage of an opportunity zone, because this is not as simple as just saying, I bought a property that's physically in an opportunity zone. That doesn't get you there. And there's some big time benefits investors could research about that. But if you buy land, close on a construction loan, and then build a new property in an opportunity zone, you typically do qualify. I'm oversimplifying it to a degree, but that puts you in a position to take advantage of that tax break. So one of those is coming up in Surprise, Arizona in January of 2021. We'll announce it.
So there's really a lot that you, an investor, can do at scale here. If you want to learn more, Steve put a report together for you at getricheducation.com/fourplex. Tell us what's in that report.
So we're constantly diving into what's happening in these markets. We put them on our blog. We've consolidated all these into these reports so you can see all the new updates, new employment that is coming into the market, new population growth trends, because you want to be sure that that stuff is there. And we were fully transparent on it. We'll link to all of our sourcing. We want the investors to go look and to know definitely for themselves where a market is headed. And that report's going to help them to do that.
It could be a way to start off the new year with a bang with fourplex buildings, new construction in high growth areas. Hey, it's been great to chat about this and catch up. Thanks so much for coming back onto the show. Oh yeah, another great fourplex chat there. Now, if you're the type of investor that might only have enough for a small down payment, maybe just looking for your next renovated single-family home or your first one, or you're just the type of person that's looking to optimize every single invested dollar for the highest cash flow possible, then this probably is not for you. But like we said, if you've got a few $100K that you need to deploy, this could be a more efficient way to do it as you're dealing with fewer properties for more invested dollars. If a year from now, you think you need to move funds for, say, a 1031 exchange where you trade up for a bigger property and legally pay zero tax on your capital gain, or maybe even 2 years from now, hey, reach out and learn more at getricheducation.com/fourplex. You'll want to find your place in line. With equity accumulating at a pretty rapid pace in your existing properties today, you might be able to trade up sooner than you think. And that way you're not really investing with much of your own cash. What you're doing is you're using equity to move it along and reset your leverage. So if you've got single family homes or duplexes or even larger properties that now have, say, 50% equity in them, which is 2-to-1 leverage, well, you could reposition here at 4-to-1 leverage and control a higher overall real estate value in your portfolio. And you know, some have asked me, why didn't you have this fourplex page on the Get Rich Education website sooner? After all, I do have this lineage of starting out with fourplexes myself. Well, there are just so many things to do every day in life. Now that we have the page there, over 200 of you have already opted in for this Build-To-Rent Fourplex report. Many of you are those that regularly prowl across our GRE Turnkey page, and that's how you found it. You know how I like to leave you with something actionable. So if you think it might be for you, see what they have going on, get the Insider's Investor Report, and connect with the provider all at the same time at getricheducation.com/fourplex. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.